Hello, everyone. It's time to eat, drink, and be merry with your hosts, Lisa and Nancy.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Big Blend Radio. We're going to eat, drink, and be merry in the urban lands. We're going to go foraging. We're so excited to have anthropologist, herbalist, and expert forager, say that 10 times real fast, Lisa M. Rose on the show. And we love Lisa's here on Big Blend Radio, don't we, Nancy?
Oh, of course.
I know it's the best name. You named me Lisa, and we have another Lisa
For
joining
a
us.
reason.
And I love that she's an urban forager and her last name is Rose. I mean, come on, this is perfect. We can eat roses, you know. So she is the author of what is just this exquisite book. It's called Urban-Foraging, Find, Gather, and Cook 50 Wild Plants. It's out through Timber Press, and Timber Press is awesome. We've really covered a lot of their books on the shows, and it's out now. Now, go to Lisa's website. It's burdocandrose.com. Go figure. That Rose is in there. So welcome, Lisa. How are you?
Fantastic. And thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about plants, food, and anything that comes in between those two subjects.
I'm excited because of the anthropology side of it, because, you know, we look at civilization came from farming, right? Isn't that part of that? And then Nancy and I were talking because we've lived in different countries and half of our lives have been in Kenya and South Africa. And so when you talk about anthropology, Nancy, who did we have as our neighbors? The Leakeys.
Oh, Louis Leakey, the Leakey family, Philip Louis Leakey and Mary Leakey. And
humans have been growing up alongside plants for as long, across space and time for many, many moons. And it's a passion of mine, and academically was my training based in anthropology with a focus actually on food systems and how farming has changed civilization and how we've changed farming in return. So yes, that's been a core for my academic career with food.
Living in Africa, if you want to talk about foraging, where
way of life.
when we were there. Most of the population did forage for their food. They hunted and they foraged for their food. And I'm talking about the indigenous people. And you learn something from them, especially when you hired them as cooks in your house and such, and they would bring in herbs that they went and got.
And down the street.
Yeah, and things that we didn't know until they taught us.
I remember telling Nancy, as a kid, I used to eat these little black berries that they taught me. I had black friends that would, on our way home from school, we didn't go to the candy store. We were eating from the side of the road. And there were these blackberries, and I keep telling Nancy it was lantana. And lantana, I don't know what it is that I was eating, but it's like the lantana plant that had blackberries on it, and I can taste it. It's almost licorice.
That's delicious.
But lantana, it's poisonous to animals.
I know, but what is? Do you know what I'm talking about, Lisa?
I'd have to see the plant and know specifically where you're from, where you were at the time. But I think that you bring up a couple of points that most of the world outside the United States and Western culture in general still has a strong connection to where their food comes from. They have many communities, Latin America, South America, Asia, Africa. There are traditions that continue to incorporate the plants that grow just outside their doorstep into both just the culinary tradition and also herbal medicine. And for us as Westerners, we're about 3 generations removed from really being reliant on the natural world for subsistence and for healthcare. And I think that urban foraging, is just my way of really, it's my 3rd book with Timber Press, but specifically aimed at an urban audience to nudge at the edges to reconnect people to, that nature is nearby. It's not necessarily out at, the national park or state park or even your
you don't want to forage
park.
in a national park, you'll get in trouble. National forest, maybe you can do it. I mean, that's what we do is parks, and there's lines on that depending on who, what, and where, and it is
absolutely
different.
Absolutely, there are rules, and in urban foraging, I do really double click into the rules that you do need to know about, the municipal parks, the state parks. All have not only rules of what can be harvested, and in some places you can harvest berries and nuts and whatnot if you're, camping or backcountry. Again, depends on the place and the organization, but it's also quite important to understand the history of use of the land, because you may have permission, but it's not necessarily safe to gather. So that's something
that's a huge part. I think when your introduction into the book, you give all this list of like, be careful of this, and we've done shows. Rita Koplinetsky, she's since passed, and she wrote a book about Agent Orange. And she said, never live near a railroad tracks, because the chemicals spill. And she had a child that was born deformed because of Agent Orange and her husband fighting in Vietnam. And so it went down and down and down. But going back to your book at the beginning, I was reading all these things, and it could kind of throw you off. You think, oh, I'm going to go out foraging. Now here's this list of things you really need to know, which I think are so important. But your list of things, what I think is so cool on this really big positive, is that we're going to learn our surroundings and how much of your community is contaminated. Just think about it,
Yes.
How is your backyard safe, quite frankly?
Yep. Well, and I think, especially having origins in Flint, Michigan, which now we know many communities have followed the Flint water crisis. Our land has a history of use, industrial, agricultural, and I do focus on historical. Prehistory is a lighter footprint, another matter entirely, but really it's important wherever you are to really understand, orient yourself to place and ask yourself, okay, do I know what's transpired here? And as a longtime urban gardener, knowing how to order soil tests, work with my extension agency, I think that communities were smarter about lead in food production and arsenic. You mentioned railroad tracks. That's my framework of consideration. It's as an urban gardener, I might soil test, but as a forager, if I'm, walking through my neighborhood or downtown along my river, I'm not carrying a soil test with me or driving my, a creepy van full of equipment testing, in the neighborhood. I have to rely on data points and inputs for me to say, okay, I know that I'm on the river, and historically up and down, we'll use the Grand River, for example, in Grand Rapids. We're furniture city, USA, right? So for 120 years, we'd been making furniture, and that, paint factories and lacquers and whatnot have all, we have those legacy chemicals in the riverways, and I think that doesn't mean, however, I'd throw all of it, the baby out with the bathwater, proverbially speaking. It's a reference point for me. There are some, if I was walking by and I noticed June berries or crab apples, growing along, in a landscaped area, if I knew I had permission to do some snacking, and if it just rained, I wouldn't be so concerned with the data point that it's, had been furniture city and there was a paint factory up the street. I'd be more concerned around harvesting roots, harvesting greens, those plants that and foods that we eat for mineral density. Those plants are also going to take up lead, right? If they take up iron, they take up calcium, they take up phosphorus, they're going to take up the arsenic, they're going to take up the lead. And so that's again, I consider the book, and as well in my other writings for foraging, having a framework to understand the history of use, to understand, start to get to really understand how the plants take up the nutrients and the minerals. And then again, these are data points for me. They're input me to make a decision whether or not, it's like for me going into a sushi restaurant when I was pregnant for my children. Did I eat sushi? Yes, I ate sushi. I made an informed choice. I drank espresso and an occasional glass of red wine. So really, there's
good for you.
Yeah,
I was just going to go, you bad girl.
No, but I love this because, again, I just feel like you're connecting people to their community and making us look at how healthy is our community. If we can't, eat the daylily, like daylilies are one of those that it's actually something we've been talking about, Nancy and I, for a while. Over the last year, we went from like Arkansas to Oklahoma. We travel the country, literally. And there were these really almost like red daylilies. And we're like, what's going on with this? And then we started like, why everybody has them on the front of their yards? Like, what's going on? There's like everybody wants a daylily thing,
It was a fashion statement.
But I know,
flowers.
but there was something, and it turned out that they actually became invasive in all these communities.
Oh yeah.
But you can eat them, and daylilies are cool, and most landscapers for cities use them because of their low water usage. But in your book, you talk about you can eat them, and we've talked about that on shows before about them being edible. So it's like, okay, but when you start going into city areas, okay, this is really pretty, we're doing this, but are they edible in a municipality roadway? Like you don't want to go to the median of a highway.
Yeah. Well, and what I've learned, and and part of it perhaps is, as we age, we learn things aren't black and white, right? It's a spectrum of color. And, I think that for me, I do want to democratize food, democratize health, and help people connect immediately to, to be able to gather plants and make beautiful foods with them and enjoy life. But, and also, again, I think you had used the phrase to stop, and I'll add the words consider and start to reflect on some of these deeper questions, right? That we're so used to being able to go on autopilot and go into the grocer and pick out foods, which I'm going to put in air quotes, have been deemed safe. And, I've worked in food for the majority, if not most, all of my professional career. And, pesticides on your lawn and pesticides on conventional agricultural product, I go to toe. I'm actually going to guess that there's a heavier pesticide residual on the conventional agricultural product that we get at the grocery store. So for me, again, it's about a framework. It builds conversation. I approach this as an opportunity to really ask more questions. In fact, I leave with more questions than answers frequently, right? And it's at the end of the day, I don't want people feeling despondent or that there's a lack of hope because of all that we've done to this point. Rather, conversely, to be empowered and emboldened to say, we got to do something about this. We've got to, even if it's within my own corner of my backyard or front yard, even.
Right.
I want to start to cultivate a diverse ecosystem that's regenerative, that adds value back to the ecosystem, not just extracts nutrients.
Well, I think this is so huge because it's also so like we talk about this on the show all the time, that to not have dead space, dead zones in our communities. So we have in the ocean, we have these dead zones from oil spills and et cetera, et cetera. But we are doing that in our communities by paving things off. But if we garden for wildlife, half of those herbs that we can garden for wildlife and birds are actually herbs and things that we can use as humans. We're also losing herbs. Really, there are certain herbs, depending on where you live, that are going extinct, and we can grow them that are part of healing, natural healing. So I think that's an important thing that we could look at doing. And also, what do we plant in our parks and communities? I've seen that movement also being like, hey, maybe we want to plant things that someone walking down the street can pick an apple and eat it. And there's nothing like a fresh apple right off the tree. Nothing.
Edible landscapes, permaculture. I think having engagement across, I love what you mentioned, working with the park system. I love working with my parks and recs teams across at the local and state levels. It helps us work in concert to create ecosystems that are, again, just to have a depth to them that they might not otherwise have, and in doing it in a way that brings people in and have, it's an opportunity to have new stakeholders at the table, right? To help understand the history of the parks and the role of, how what we consider invasives, how did it get here? Who brought it here? Usually humans brought it there. Plant is taken over. So
pretty much.
How are we implicated in this, right? And it's, for me, it's this ongoing conversation and opportunity for learning that I think is really powerful and can be transformational, especially to those of us living in cities where we feel so, held up by the concrete and not connected to each other, and the sense of disconnection, right? I think people will say, oh, well, you included the crab apples and the brambles with the blackberries in your book. Isn't that cheating? And I'd say, not if you're in the city and you have no idea what these plants are. It is not cheating. You don't even know what it is, because
lilacs, people have lilacs in their backyard.
Lilac, many of our plants that are used even in landscaping have edible use, right? And medicinal properties. And so for me, it's really helping shift that narrative to those of us that haven't ever looked at our landscape in that way, or had an opportunity, right? There's an element of exposure too, that when you're in the city, being in the Great Lakes and in Grand Rapids or Flint, Detroit, there are folks and kids that had never been out to Lake Michigan, for example, from Grand Rapids. They've never seen the big lake. Yeah, it's living in California, working in Berkeley, kids hadn't been out to,
like Yosemite or Muir Woods.
We're not even going to Yosemite. We're just talking across the bay, right? It's not.
I know. But sometimes even your neighborhood park.
Yes. Yeah. And there's lots of conceptions and misconceptions and fear and mistrust. And it's systematic, and it's, kind of come across time that we have these relationships with outdoor spaces. And so with urban foraging, it's just that I said, even in, the dedication to the book and to the peoples of Flint, prehistoric, historic, and fair residents, may we come together to have these difficult conversations and come to solutions on how we're going to fix some things that are in benefit of both the ecology and us humans that live there.
There's one place that Lisa and I lived where we had our own backyard garden, and we were attempting to garden, and it took us several attempts because soil testing, what it was. It'd been kind of depleted or contaminated or whatever. And we noticed that, remember, Lisa, the birds, that we had a bird feeder, and the birds all had these little tumors or nodules on their legs and
their face.
And their face around their bill. And we're like, wow, we've never seen that before. And then we started thinking, well, we have a garden. Do we really want to eat the food that we're growing here? Because what's going on with the soil here? What's happening here? Is it
we did it though? We did it. We worked hard. We transformed
really hard.
We transformed that place, and people would stop at our garden. And we used native plants in the front.
Yeah.
We had a mulberry tree, right? So mulberry trees is one of those that you can do. We grew a lot of natives and ones that were resistant. We were in the high desert, outside Joshua Tree National Park.
Mm-hmm.
And the house that we had purchased was the person, when we bought it from the owner, and he went around cutting down the desert primrose, telling me, here's these weeds you need to take out. I'm like, stop right there.
Stop it.
Stop cutting this or we're not buying the house.
Stop
and the Datura, which actually, by the way, Datura is really cool, but don't smoke it. Don't do that, everybody. Do not smoke that.
You know what?
Nancy pulled her back gardening, and it was the one thing in the bathtub.
It's the one thing. You take a leaf or two of Datura and put it in hot bath water. Don't drink it, eat it, or chew on it. But if you put it in bath water, your muscle aches go away real fast.
And I don't know if that's legally good or not, but anyway, I'm just saying. In case.
I'm just telling you.
But we balanced this ecosystem of natives, and then we grew our own vegetables, and like we did cantaloupe amongst native flowers like Datura and stuff. And it was the best cantaloupe. And we changed the soil, getting the toxins. So this house had basically still had these toxins from when they built it. Yeah. And so we had to redo the soil. And that's what we can do. But you're talking about urban foraging, which is really interesting. In regards
how do you know what you're picking? Like neighborhood, you know the plant, but do you know the soil that the plant is in?
Well, that too is one of the as part of a framework to understand, if you're gathering roots or gathering leafy greens from an area that you're not certain, you haven't tested, and have a suspicion that it's contaminated with lead or other contaminants, that if in doubt, don't harvest there. That's actually there is that reality of at the end of the day, if you can't make it come to a decision with a high degree of certainty, then it's whether favorable plant ID. I do cover basic botany in the book, but because I'm covering so many different regions, it's really a prerequisite or a requisite to have a regional guide that's specific, whether it's the high desert, the Great Lakes, Pennsylvania, California, Pacific Northwest, Florida. Like, those are all very different regions where, the genus and species might look different, right? Absolutely. Where it's showing up for you. And
yes. And you talk about, like, don't just think the plant. You want it to be this plant, but I know how that is. You want to identify this. I'm on like iNaturalist and all of that. And then you go, no, it's this. I know it's this. And then people go, no, it's not. Yeah. What do you mean it's not?
And that's a lifelong journey and lifelong learning, right? Like, as you continue to learn plants, it is a beauty of it. But also, I always say, if you don't know what it is, don't put it in your mouth. It's like working with my kids.
But this is the beauty of your book. I really love it because you really are connecting people with the land. And, there's farming. There's things like when we lived in Julian up in the mountains in San Diego, there was miner's lettuce, clover that was growing wild, like and apples. It's an apple, but that was what we planted. What do you think about people changing their front yards to be edible for other people walking down the street to have food? What do you think about that concept? Would that go away from the foraging?
Not at all. I think I'm going to unpack the scenario that you just set up. I think cultivating wherever you live, cultivating a biodiverse habitat for food, for birds, for pollinators, and for people is beautiful. And also, I think that's really what the book I want to nudge people toward, right, is to really work on cultivating diverse habitats. Doing it within a community, I think that, it depends on how, your community or neighborhood is set up. I think that there's wonderful ways to set up collaborative gardens, shared gardens, if you're feeding your community. I think it's one thing to grow food and then have it, picked by somebody that doesn't necessarily have permission or, agreements. But those types of situations can be, I think, actually both navigated and created to be positive experiences, right? From a community building perspective. And New York, I do quite a bit of colleagues in New York, and in many neighborhoods, you've got small community gardens where, you've got 5, 6, 7 buildings on the block of folks, contributing and sharing. And it creates an opportunity for exchange, right? Exchange, not just of produce, but ideas and to build relationships. I know for me, I've always had a garden when my children were little, up until, for my first house for almost 12, 13 years, my garden was in the front yard because the backyard, there wasn't room. And it begat lots of conversations and curiosity and questions and moments for, sharing, intergenerational sharing. One lady, she's now no longer with us, but she was in her late 80s. This is probably 2002, 2003. She remembered the victory gardens of World War II, right? She was able to connect in that way. She didn't prefer the aesthetic. That's another matter, right? She preferred her Kentucky bluegrass, which was very, very well manicured. But she could understand what I was doing with it, which was using it to feed my family, right? I was using the food, and my kids were in the garden and gathering produce and whatnot. So, I look at that moment, that exchange with my neighbor, and it's a win, right? It develops a relationship and conversation from just that
Nancy
simple
did
act.
the similar thing with her front yard in California. I don't know if I was even born then, right? Tore out the lawn.
My grandmother she lived through the Depression, and she taught me, this is how you garden, this is what you do. And she always had this, whatever you plant it 3 times, because you need one for God, one for nature, and one for yourself. And yeah, that was her, her outtake on it. And she grew vegetables at the very back of her property. She also grew a patch out the front, and then the lawn came after the one patch that she said was her way of giving back, so that anybody who was walking by could take a tomato, take a cucumber, whatever was there at the time. And she grew it for that. And then she really got excited when somebody took something. She was like, this is cool. I'm helping somebody. It was her way of.
I do see in urban communities, churches, synagogues, mosques in Grand Rapids specifically. We have multiple places of worship where there are community gardens, and it is actually based on, the gleaning, leaving the corners for gleaning, integrating, again, tenets of faith. And in my opinion, if that's the way you want to go about it, that's fine. It works. You're feeding the animals, you're feeding the people, you're contributing to the common good. And, I think that, again, in the city, we immediately, there's this idea of like, oh my gosh, how could these things coexist? Foraging and gardening and greening, green space and growing your own food. But the reality is there's a lot of opportunity. It just requires a little bit of elbow grease and a little bit of watching, paying attention, using all of our senses to look at what is and what's possible.
Well, yeah, when we were in Arizona, we really have lived everywhere. Apparently, that's why we are gypsies. And I'm looking at your gypsy tea in your book too.
Yeah, I know.
I need that. But when what's interesting is I have in Arizona we have mesquite trees, right, where we were.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And so people would go and harvest the mesquite beans, and there were not flour mills, but people would mill them
to ground them,
to make them into flour. So that was a cultural thing too. So I think part of what you're doing, you talk about elderberry in your book too. And elderberry to me takes me back to when we lived in England. There was this thing about elderberry and elderberry wine and dandelion wine. Listen, I have to ask this. I'm sorry, but I'm going to be childish because I know it's the first thing a lot of us look at. Okay, we're going to go urban foraging. We've been taught now that dandelions are good, right? Whenever I see dandelions anywhere in the city, I go, you're doing something good. You're not killing the dandelions. They're good for our soil, good for us. But then you harvest the dandelions. How do you know if a dog peed on that dandelion?
Oh,
I have to go there. I know it's childish, but I'm going there because
my
you know
God.
people are thinking it.
That's very,
of course,
that
that's-
actually is a very, very practical question. I actually get quite a bit. And my rule of thumb is, I don't really gather, I actually just don't at all, about 3 feet on either side of the sidewalks, outside of bars and restaurants, absolutely not. Even if it's a gardening container, no.
By trees.
Like nothing
Don't do
in
it
that.
by trees.
don't do it by the fire hydrant.
Trees, yeah, no fire hydrant.
No fire hydrants, no
The head of
trees.
They really do
walking
like the
trail.
fire hydrant. I mean, we pet sit as we travel across the
then
country,
you
and I can
do-
tell you, fire hydrants are really real
But-
for them.
Yeah. And it's, go ahead.
You do wash things, even if you get them at the grocery store. You do
wash 'em.
wash.
Well, yeah, you do
things.
wash them. Some things though don't. I mean, it's like when I do talk about understanding the waterways and where you are upstream or downstream. There are some things, here in Michigan we have, well, same with California, many places, lots of ag runoff into our water. If you're downstream from a dairy farm after a rain and you're looking at gathering not elderberries, but nettles, right, or something that would have wet feet, cattails or cattail roots, I think that it's important to understand when washing isn't good enough, right? You're not from a whether it's E. coli, whether it's salmonella, like these are real potential contaminants, sewage, wastewater treatment plants. Again, these are just those large infrastructure pieces that we just want to just be aware of, right?
But that's what I say was so cool about your book is you're making us look at our land, our community, the land in our community in a different way. If it's not good enough to eat, we need to look at cleaning our environment.
Well, yeah.
And then at the same time, you're giving us recipes. And you talk about nettles in here. Nettles, from what I've learned, is that nettles are good for our body, health-wise, especially for women and for calming down and all kinds. Nettles are healthy. So you want them to be as pristine as you can get them, right? And I don't know many
delicious.
people. I mean, you have nettles.
I don't think I've ever had a nettle.
But you make nettle risotto. Nettle risotto.
They taste like
Nancy
spinach.
loves risotto. You're gonna like this nettle risotto.
Okay.
But then, like spinach.
But then I'm looking at the catnip, and I want to have.
Oh, Nancy wants the catnip.
I want the catnip with dark rum. With we're in a house now where we have 10 cats.
10 cats.
And
well, I mean, you have to fight your cats with that. I
know. I want to have catnip with the cats.
No, but I want to go to the acorn bread too. The acorn. Now we did actually used to grow catnip for our cats, and one cat, Nelson, when we lived in South Africa.
Oh my gosh,
he was a rescue that actually just landed. That's a whole other story. But Nancy, he was not he was part lynx, man. He was like a wild cat, and he was mean, but he was sweet but mean.
Yeah,
and
depending.
Nancy planted catnip for him, and he went, and that was his catnip. Don't get near him.
He sat by it all day long.
That was
if you walked by it, he growled.
Exactly. It's supposed to make him happy and silly, but then it becomes this was my
catnip, and nobody
get off
else.
of it. Don't look at it. Don't touch it. This is my catnip. Yeah, it was a big deal, but
I remember just a beautiful, even thinking about the cat and that the ownership that he ended up taking over that little spot of gardens.
It was
and
awesome.
Yes, there's that. It is awesome, and I think you even as gardeners, it just generates this source of pride and
it was
you do feel ownership over it. Granted, cats and catnip have a little more intense relationship even. But it does make me think of just how watching kids garden and at the schoolyard gardening that I've done across my career, like they just develop this sense of connection
Oh,
to
it's so awesome.
the plants that is just it's so from a human evolution perspective, it's just like it taps into something very old, ancient, and feral that has existed with us across time and space. And it's what I do love making it when it's delicious like that, and you can lure folks in, with the acorn bread. I call that my gateway forager snack. That and when, once I share with folks, that there's acorn flour used in my banana bread, and of course after I vet to make sure no one's allergic to nuts, they're just amazed, and kids will just be like, "No way, Miss Rose, there are acorns in this," and I'd be like, "Yeah, dude, there are acorns in that."
But that's a huge deal. Like,
it is.
I'll go back to when we lived in Julian, because that's what your book really took us back to this, because you have your regular gardens, but what was growing in the woods and everything was something we could take. And even if you went by a farmer's plot and there was a tree hanging with apples, he would be cool with you taking an apple, because if he's not harvesting it at that point, eat it. It's good on this day. You know what I mean? And it was just, there was wild grapes growing, and the birds would really get them, but you'd get a few grapes and you could eat them, and it's like, and people made wine or made what they needed with it. There was elderberry there, miner's lettuce. Like people made salads with miner's lettuce, well, and to me that, and acorns were a thing. Now, if you go to the indigenous peoples and they make you things with acorns, you may not want, like, you may have a hard time tasting that in the way we're all raised. If you're not indigenous people, you may not enjoy the Nancy, you've done that out in Julian at that time, but the acorn bread, now for the rest of us, that might be something that is the gateway to the acorn. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, and I think you bring up a good point in that our palates are have been acclimated to two flavor profiles, sweet and salty, right?
I knew it.
Salt and vinegar chips and glazed donuts, both of which I love. But that is not, those two flavors are not regularly occurring
in nature.
Flavors in nature. Yeah. So, I mean, the most sweet you might get would be a maple syrup, or, a cane sugar. But, and salt wise, it would be, perhaps, seaweeds, right? If you're going to have on that
Kelp.
Salty profile.
Yeah.
But on the whole, in the United States, especially, we, bitter flavors, bitter greens, bitter herbs. The arugula, in my opinion, is not bitter, or it has a spicy flavor. But the endives and the chicories, those aren't really a fit with the American palate, because we just don't eat that way any longer, right? You go to Europe, endives are on the plates, right? Chicory salad is something that's very common throughout Northern Europe. It's just something that we're no longer used to in our palate.
You can drink chicory root too.
It's true, but it's really true. Like one house that we purchased, everybody down the street had a circular driveway and a lawn, and I pulled the lawn up, and the neighbors got really upset. And I put in native plants and flowers and
wildflowers.
Wildflowers. And they really got angry because I disturbed the look of the circular drive with the little grassy
manicurization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, and I watched them go out, mow the lawn at the end of the week and grumble about it. And I was like, okay. I put in plants and birds came, and it was pretty, it was beautiful. And then people started stopping by and looking at it. And I was like, you know what? The lawn, I get it.
You want kids to play and dogs to play on it. Right. But I think this is what again, Lisa's talking about, is that communication.
Right.
If we can have that interaction with people, that's a huge thing. If we can have that interaction in gardening, foraging, I think the foraging, it's cool if you can, nip and tuck from your neighbors a little bit here and there. Get the oranges. You talk about, persimmons and things like that too, that you can nip and tuck, but it is about kind of going back to our roots. You've opened our minds. Just want to say that. This is so cool. The recipes in the book are super cool, and you bring in pine trees. I want to get into that too, because there's so many forests that people can be harvesting, because that's what our roots were. We're harvesting. I wanted to ask you this about being in anthropology, right? When you look at plants, so we've done so many Native American sites and cliff dwellings, and then they were growing gardens. So they had their own civilization farming stuff going on, and they were really smart about water techniques and the waffle art. Have you seen the waffle gardens? How they do.
Yep.
Right?
Santa Fe's got a lot.
Oh, Santa Fe.
It.
Go to the rail yard railroad. It's the rail yard conservancy park. They have that. They show it, and it's wow, they were smart, man, and they are today too. So all of these they were farming, and they had a filtration system, and so, but it was farming, but it wasn't. It's just different in that it is kind of still foraging in a way too, right? With what they were doing.
Well, I think that, the indigenous knowledge that has existed across time, working with just different ways of agriculture, ways of cultivating plants, and working with the immediate available water resources, that really was the only way to farm until industrialization came along and colonialization came along. And we developed ways of farming that were input heavy and extractive, right? We were no longer, there's a shift for 101 reasons. And, fast forward to today, where our global food system is heavily dependent on trade, tariffs, volume, commodity crops, very petroleum based, and I think that we do have, I think, just upstate in Traverse City, and even, here in the Kalamazoo region, just, northeast of Chicago, our tribes are still very alive and well with their working knowledge of how to work with the land. It's, I think, restoring that food sovereignty that was taken from them during the treaties in the 1800s. They too have a lot of healing to go through, because we'd taken away their traditional ways of learning and passing on that knowledge that once was just was, right. That was just how.
Well, they have ancient knowledge that's been passed down.
Correct.
They didn't pillage the earth. You know what I mean?
No,
that's kind of the difference. Look
what happened in Yuma.
No.
Big Ag went in and they tore down a whole bunch of stuff, and they put in one singular crop. They never used to have whitefly, but they put in one crop, and all of a sudden, here comes whitefly.
California is a huge, huge center of big agriculture, and we do see today. We're at a tipping point. I think that as we look at supply chain, the fragility of the supply chain, the brittleness of not just the production, but also the water supply, right?
Yes.
California, I moved back to Michigan because of the accessibility of water. And
wow, that's funny because you talk about Flint, but it's true. I mean, Central California.
That irony.
Well, although I know,
really.
But the water issue because of the almonds, right? It is.
Salinas, Salinas Valley, the water table is actually the soil is sinking there in the valley, and because
have you driven through Hinckley? Have you been through Hinckley?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? That is, and in your book you talk about the brown areas, like and that's it. I'm going, this is supposed to be refuge land, and it's dead. And Hinckley, Erin Brockovich land, right?
Yep.
And when you drive through it, they're going through it again. And I'm going, how can you be going through this again?
Still.
Like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
You know, and then you think you go into Ridgecrest and all these mining right up the road.
Do you know how long it takes the earth to shake off what we've done?
It's insane.
Yeah, so it'll take a while.
It'll take, but that's again, that's what I love about your book. Mm-hmm. You're reconnecting us with our roots, and I mean literally, right? And going, hey, it should be safe for us to just pick this piece of, mint or persimmon or pine and be able to do it. That's how we've lived. That's how we ancestrally were. And we should,
and small steps too. I think what
yes,
it's easy to become from my point of view, one, despondent, two, hopeless, three, overwhelmed, right? And so, I think for those of us not, immersed in the food system, people are just like, where do I even start? How do I just want to put dinner on the table.
You got recipes. I mean, this is a cool family project, I think, for families and people to go out and say, this is a new hobby. I mean, listen, I belong to mushroom groups. Okay. I'm weird. And I don't even know what I'm looking at, but they're just so beautiful. And I'm like, and I don't know if I can even pick them. They're so pretty. But, but you have to be careful and understand, but this is learning your surroundings, and your book having these recipes, these guidelines, you're giving these people, hey, we can go out and be part of what we're supposed to be, but families can learn and kids can go out there with phones and ID things. It's like this cool project. I really see this as a family project. Really, I know.
Oh, a family
single
garden
people
in your own backyard
to do it. But awesome. I mean, for people to go out in their community, maybe walk the landscape, the river, whatever it is, start looking at what you have. What is this?
Yeah.
And that's how we can communicate with our municipalities too.
Yeah. I hope, and I'm glad that you see that opportunity with the book. It is definitely, that was beautiful. The direction thank you.
And definitely those photos are cool.
My photographer is as passionate as all of us on the chat today. She's out of Chicago. Amazing. And yes, a food advocate and an advocate for the wild spaces and awesome. To really reconnect people with nature. So I've been very, very excited to just get everybody's feedback and excitement for the opportunities. And again, as you had said, to look at things differently and to see things with opportunity and hope, in especially times and in areas now that seem really challenging and difficult.
No, I think that's a really big key. We can't panic. We need to do and move forward and just get involved. And I think that's something even during COVID and the pandemic we learned, being holed away in a home. I mean, we were still traveling and stuff, but being so many of us sheltered in place for so long that we started looking in our backyards. Oh, now we're redoing our house instead of selling it. Now all these things have changed. Work, all of that.
Yep.
And I think your book ties in perfectly with that. I mean, you even teach us how to use a prickly pear. We lived in the desert. We had prickly pears, and we still never really knew what to do and how to do it. And now I'm like, that's it. I'm moving back to Tucson now, or the high desert. I'll go either place. And I need to go play with prickly pears, and you can get them, but prickly pears were growing everywhere.
And it actually grows across the United States. And if life gives you prickly pears, you just make margaritas.
Yes, and
alrighty then. Now you're talking my language.
The nopalitos. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love your book. It's beautiful. And are all the recipes yours?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the basic jam recipe is pretty much straightforward, basic jam recipe.
And you got roses in there. You got roses.
I did get roses. All the recipes really have come from my direct experiences with plants, and also a person and or people that I've made these dishes with. So from that aspect, I write about what I know, and what I have futzed with over time. And, I'm one of those cooks that'll just, improvise and shape it to be what it is, and add little nuances to it. And if, the mushrooms, the morels are out at the same time I'm making my nettle risotto, then in go the morels, or sometimes they're shiitakes, right, that go in with the nettles. But I think that I've been
I want to
really
come to your
lucky.
house for dinner. That's all I'm saying.
I'm just really lucky to be able to improvise, and that does come from, a mom that had a garden, when we lived in Flint, when we lived on the west side of the state. It was really to feed her family. She was a cook out of more out of necessity than, a high-end chef or high cuisine. But at the same time, when we had lockdown, I was really confident that I could extend my pantry for much more than 2 weeks, what I had on hand. And they were basic foodstuffs, and coupled with, springtime and foraging, I was lucky enough to have that in my backpack, right? And I think that, and not only just to be functional, but to be delicious, right?
I think there's going to be restaurants that really use your book too, because I know chefs and we know restaurants that they're into the wild foraging part, but it's like, this is such a resource for them. But like for people to right now, even when you look at inflation, like, hey, maybe I do make flour from the mesquite tree. Oh, and you know what? It's probably better for my immune system. Just like we talk about local honey. Before you go, I have to ask. Queen Anne's lace. So I've been photographing this across the country, and I'm enamored with this beautiful plant. I had no idea. It's a carrot. I didn't know. Am I right? It's a carrot?
Yeah, it is wild carrot. It is wild carrot. And the tricky one with that one, that out of Yep, it is related. And the way that you can identify wild carrot from / Queen Anne's lace from poison hemlock is to really observe and notice the stem will have fine coarse hairs. You'll have, I like to use the analogy, the queen has hairy legs. And then also with the flower umbel, it appears that she has petticoats underneath. So you'll see bracts underneath the flower umbel, and it formulates this beautiful, when it starts to dry, this beautiful bird shape, this little nest like when it dries up. So those are a couple of tips to be able to identify it. And I love Queen Anne's lace, not just does it smell aromatically like a domestic carrot, but the seeds, if you catch them before they, they're out in the wet of the fall, if you catch them just as they are drying out, they make a wonderful culinary spice that you can grind them with together with sea salt. Yep, and you can use it to sprinkle it onto roasted vegetables. Incorporate it into an herb de Provence like spice blend to just give your chicken noodle soups a nice wild aromatic extra kick.
Do you know how seriously, and it is one of the most beautiful flowers. Like, it's just so beautiful. However, I have like a whole file of Queen Anne's lace, and then I have hemlock on there too, because I was unaware, and then started to realize, I naturalist. Thank you. And that's it. You learn. That's the thing. That's what I think is so cool about this. It's just like, what's on your backyard? What can you eat? What did the ancient peoples and the ancestral peoples, indigenous peoples eat? How, this is your wild lands. Having lived in Tucson, Nancy and I would walk every morning at 4 a.m. before, because especially in summer. Saguaros, there were different parts of cactus you can use. And we would walk through and we'd go like, yeah, you could eat this. And we know this land, vacant lots and stuff. No one's going to get, mad at you, but, you talk about that, ask permission. And also, I think plants also, I'm not going to get woo-woo, but there's a spiritual thing too. in picking plants. I learned that from friends, Native American friends, in picking sage. Ask the sage, is it cool if you go to pick it, it comes off in your hand? I've, done farm sits as we pet sit across the country. If you wanted to pick the pepper, if the pepper just came off in your hand, it was ready. But if you had to tug and pull,
there is a knowing.
Nature wants you to harvest, not in a mass harvest. They want it like animals go and browse. They eat little bits of this. And
it's foraging.
As they eat, they eat a couple of leaves and then more grow from them pruning it back. It's just renewal, it's renewal of the energy. So
it's better than pruning with shears. I'm just saying.
And it's better than like mass crops of all the same thing. That's not what nature did. Nature did a sprinkling of plants who got along together.
Nip and tuck.
That work
little nibbles
together. They work together.
It's a mutually there is a mutual reciprocity that exists. Again, it's that recognition. I think that I feel very strongly about that. Not just from a sustainability perspective, but that we're not coming at this as this is free stuff all over my neighborhood, rather from my own personal point of view and platform, is that the relationship does need to be there so we can work in harmony, coexistence, and have it mutually beneficial for the plants, the ecology, and the broader system, as well as for us humans.
You totally rock. Thank you for doing this, seriously, because it is about connectivity. Everything about your book is that. It's about us connecting, and it just, I love it. I love it so much. Everyone, again, it's Lisa M. Rose. Go to burdochandrose.com. Her book is Urban-Foraging, Find, Gather, and Cook 50 Wild Plants. I dare you. Go do it. Go do it. Give me the recipes later, but she's got beautiful recipes. We're going to feature one in our upcoming Eat, Drink, and Be Merry magazine. She's going to pick it out for us. I think a nice herbal thing, hot, warm. I don't know. We're getting into winter. And listen, her whole book has like a whole section. You can winter forage. Don't think just because it's snowing, you can't get out there. She's in Michigan. She knows snow. You know snow, and you can still get out there. And I didn't know you could eat tree bark. I didn't know we could eat tree bark until you talked about it. Like we've been in Indiana, where
not all of it, but some.
Okay, I know. Be careful what you say. Got all the guidelines, but like we've been in India. Oh, that's the thing, Indianapolis. We did a pet sit, and people were tapping the trees for syrup thingies.
Yep. Absolutely.
And we'd never seen that before. Talk about urban foraging right in this regular street where we're walking the dogs. Like
right in your backyard. Well, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to coming back in the springtime and sharing with readers some delicious holiday, theatric, appropriate recipes with the broader audience.
I like that you said theatric. I like that word too. So everyone, burdochandrose.com is the website. We want to thank our sponsor, Margot Carrera, fine art photographer. We do our Nature Connection shows with her every month. So keep up with that at bigblendradio.com, but also her art, go to carrerafineartgallery.com. It's all about the environment. And we're doing what we can to mitigate climate change. Let's all get together and work together on that. So keep up with her at carrerafineartgallery.com and bigblendradio.com. Thank you so much, Lisa. Take care.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, and I'll talk to you both soon.
Cool.